October 7th, while brutally torturing and killing 1,200 people, Hamas captured around 240 people in Israel and took them hostage. On August 29th, 2024, Hamas executed 6 of them, including 1 U.S. citizen. And in response to the news of the execution of 6 hostages, including 1 U.S. citizen, we saw demonstrations here in the United States praising Hamas and even Iran. I am Laura Burns, head of terrorism research at George Washington University's program on extremism. With me today is Jennifer Baker, senior research fellow at the program on extremism, and we're here to continue this series about Hamas in the U.S. then and now, where we seek to explain the evolution of Hamas, both here in the United States and in the Middle East, and identify why it is that we're seeing such vast support for the terrorist organization on U.S. soil today. What we are seeing is the echo of a strategy that was put in place more than 30 years ago.
When we ended our last episode, we were discussing the first Intifada, or uprising, that was taking place in Gaza and in the West Bank in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Yep. Yes, we were. And we had begun describing how the architect of the U.S.-based infrastructure, current Hamas Deputy Political Bureau Chief Musa Abu Marzouk, how he designed and implemented that U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure that operated under the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee here in the United States, and how they began to use that infrastructure not only to help Hamas fight Israel, but to help Hamas gain power over other Palestinian groups, and particularly Fatah.
So the U.S.-based Hamas front organizations that were identified were the HLF, which was also known as the Occupied Land Fund in the early years, the IAP, and the UASR. We will continue discussing them and Marzouk today. But first, let me ask you about the broader U.S. Muslim Brotherhood during this time. What was going on with the broader group in America during the first Intifada?
So Mohammed Akram, a leader with Marzouk in the early U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure, wrote a document defining what the Muslim Brotherhood's strategy in the United States was during the first Intifada. And in that document, he described how members of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood should settle and develop here in the United States. And he talked about doing that through a process that we'll talk about in a minute. The title of this particular document that Mohammed Akram wrote was An Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal for the Group in North America. And when we talk about the group, that is a reference to the Muslim Brotherhood, whereas we talk about the movement, that's a reference to Hamas. So it was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood's overall strategy here. And just a note, the Arabic term for Muslim Brotherhood is Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So if you hear someone refer to the Ikhwan or Ikhwani, that is a reference to a Muslim Brotherhood member. So going back to the actual document that was written by Mohammed Akram in 1991, this explanatory memorandum, it was quite lengthy. But one of the pertinent parts that we want to talk about, let me go back and say this document was found in all of the other Hamas documents located at the home of Ismail el-Barassi in that 2004 FBI search warrant. So that's where this document came from. And in the document, it explains how the Muslim Brotherhood in America frankly desired over time to destroy our democracy and replace it with Sharia law.
The document is an extremely important example of Muslim Brotherhood thinking in the West. It shows the mindset that the group's leadership has in terms of thinking long-term, in thinking in steps. It's a gradualism that characterizes the Brotherhood. The idea that when you're weak, you just show, let's say, a soft facade, you infiltrate society, you create the foundations of your movement, but they always have clear in mind what the long-term goals should be. So they work on the short and midterm, but they have clear in mind what they want long-term. And long-term from them means centuries. there's a way of thinking that is very common in Brotherhood circles. And the document that was found in the US is very similar to other programmatic documents that were found in the houses of top Brotherhood leaders in other parts of the world. So it matches with an approach that is common within the Brotherhood. And the language is somewhat similar. The language used in this document is particularly telling and particularly strong, talking of a civilization jihadist process, the idea of a grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, which is extremely strong language.
The document outlined their focus on media, publications, how to spread the dawah. Remember, that's what we call it, their preachings, their ideology, and how to use the organizations that they had as front organizations already in the United States to accomplish that. And at the end of the memorandum, it listed which organizations it could rely on to help with that process. And there are a number of those that you can see in the document. But of course, the HLF, the IAP, the UASR, and NATE that we talked about in the last episode, and a group called the Muslim Arab Youth Association were included as organizations who were going to contribute to that mission.
I think it's important to note here that this group, according to their own document, was against Western democracy and sought to sabotage it. This was a Muslim Brotherhood document, but do we have documents showing what Hamas sought to do?
Yes, so that clearly showed that they wanted, the Muslim Brotherhood had an interest in replacing democracy with their version of Sharia law. But shortly after Hamas's creation, it ratified a covenant or charter, kind of like a constitution, that clearly defined its mission, its principles, and its methods. Interestingly, one of the outlets to publish the Hamas charter in Arabic was the IAP here in the United States. An English translation of the charter shows in its preamble, it says, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it, end quote. That was a quote citing Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna that we talked about in our last episode. The preamble goes on to say, our struggle is against the Jews, and it is great and very serious. And that it identifies Hamas as its Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Article 7 quotes, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Interestingly, moving on to Article 8 of the Hamas covenant, it says, Allah is the target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran is its constitution, and jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. This charter or covenant clarifies that Hamas believes all of the land upon which Israel sits belongs to Islam, and that the land must be ruled and be governed by Islamist governments, and no one, no Arab and no Palestinian, has the right to negotiate that. If you go on, interestingly, to Hamas Covenant Article 13, it says, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Hamas, this is a quote, there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. And of course, jihad in this context means violent fighting.
Well, that article does not leave a lot of room for compromise, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And we should know that the term jihad in this context is a reference to violent holy war.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Violent fighting in for the sake of, Allah. And, that brings up an excellent point where the charter even addresses Hamas's position versus the PLO and says that they'll treat them respectfully, but they noted that the PLO is a secular party, and that was unacceptable on what they consider Muslim lands. The charter then called upon, quote, writers, intellectuals, media people, orators, educators, and teachers to perform their role in cleansing children's education curriculum of ideologies inconsistent with theirs.
That statement sounds ominous and sounds almost like they wanted to brainwash the children in their schools.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk a lot about that aspect of Hamas and its radicalization methods throughout this series.
So you cover several topics on the Hamas covenant. Let's break this down for our listeners here. So in its covenant, Hamas indicates Israel must be obliterated.
That's right. Yes, it does. And when we hear the slogan, from the river to the sea, in this context, that is a reference to the obliteration of Israel and its people. The Jordan River is Israel's eastern border, and the Mediterranean Sea is to its west. And what the Hamas covenant is calling for is, through violent jihad, the conquering of that entire land.
So if someone who knows Hamas, supports Hamas, advocates for Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, they're actually advocating for the obliteration of a country in Western democracy.
Yes, because Hamas proclaimed that in their very own covenant. And we see protesters today attempt to claim that the phrase is everything from a mere call for peace and justice, other definitions that are not that specific reference to the annihilation of a country. And there's no doubt that some people in the protests actually believe that. They don't understand. But the people in the groups aligned with Hamas, they know it's not a call for peace and justice. It's a call for violence and death.
As a judge in the Gaza Strip military court dealing with Hamas as defendants, there were three things that were clear to me. One, that they were locked in on their mission. There was no doubt about that. You can like them, you can dislike them. The Hamas charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and that's exactly what this was. I mean, they really were focused on that. And it was just locked in, all hands on deck, and they meant what they said, and they said what they meant. And you know as well as I do that I learned along the way that you take, when terrorists say something, they actually mean it. They're not bullshitting you. And I think that's something that maybe in terms of your American audience is hard to understand, that when they say we're going to kill you, they actually mean, they're going to kill you.
And in their covenant, Hamas said there should be no peace conference or compromise.
That's correct. Absolutely. No to peace and compromise.
Did the Hamas infrastructure here in the U.S. hold those same beliefs?
Sure. Yes, they did. And they sought to spread their beliefs to others. During the first Intifada, the HLF and IAP held festivals and fundraising activities and conferences that were often hosted by other Muslim Brotherhood aligned organizations like the Muslim Arab Youth Association, what we call MAYA. And those fundraising activities, they included entertainment by the IAP's band, who sang songs praising Hamas, praising Sheikh Yassin, who was, again, what we refer to as Hamas' spiritual guide in the Gaza Strip. And they also praised the killing of Jews. They even performed skits about Hamas members killing Jews. They often, at these festivals, hosted famous Hamas leaders and even Osama bin Laden's spiritual guide, Abdullah Azam, to speak and raise money for the cause.
And all of that was here in the U.S.?
Yes, in places like Oklahoma City or Kansas City. U.S. cities held at U.S. hotels, and they filmed these conferences. Many of those old videotapes were found in El Barasse's home along with the other materials. Some were even unearthed from where one of the IAP band members, Mr. Fawaz Mustaha, had buried them in his yard to hide them from law enforcement and save them for later. Mustaha is one of the members of the Palestine Committee, along with, the other people that we've seen, like Musa Abu Marzouk and Mohammed Akram. In fact, one of the songs that they like to sing in these festivals, from what we've seen on the videotapes, has them singing about how they, quote, came to fulfill the covenant, which was a reference to Hamas's covenant. Other songs we've seen refer to a 628 CE battle between Islamic armies where a number of Jews were slaughtered. Khyber, O Jews.
Khyber was a very famous battle that took place between Muhammad and his followers and Jewish tribes. It's a city in today's contemporary Saudi Arabia, and it's a historical battle that saw the army of Muhammad eventually defeating Jewish tribes. Now, that's a historical fact. Islamists groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and many others use that historical event to reference.
Yeah, and as we see some of the songs continue in the videos where they sing, "Oh Jew, watch out, watch out." And you'll notice that in these videos, and I know they're hard to see, they're grainy because, I mean, keep in mind, some of them were dug up from the ground. These are all videos that are on like VCR tapes and 30 years old. But you can see the children in the background celebrating and singing these songs. You also see one of the members of the band named Munzer Talib. He's also on that Palestine Committee chart, the U.S.-based infrastructure. Munzer Talib not only sang in the IAP band, but he also raised money for the HLF. Some of the clips that we see on these videos, they're playing songs where they sing about from Jordan to Gaza, the peaceful solution is not acceptable. One of the band members is a man named Mufid Abdul-Qadir. He is the half-brother of senior long-term Hamas leader Khalid Mashal.
And I know we're going to talk a lot more about Khalid Mashal in the series.
Yes, we will. His half-brother Mufid often played the role of the Palestinian killing Jews in these festivals and skits. Not only was he a band member and an actor, but he also raised money for the HLF. So Mahmoud Zahar was a Hamas leader in Gaza at the time that these videos were made, and still is a senior leader in Hamas. Some actually credit him with helping found Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And another individual that we saw was Jamil Hamami, and he was credited with founding Hamas in the West Bank. Zahar, like we said, remains a significant leader at Hamas's political bureau even today.
Laura, you mentioned Abdullah Azan, bin Laden's spiritual advisor, and he raised money for the HLF?
Yes, you can see a videotape that had been recorded where Abdullah Azan is speaking about fighting for the sake of jihad, and the Occupied Land Fund fundraising just flashes on the screen as he's speaking. Send money to. So, interestingly, we have videos from a number of these HLF IAP events during the first Intifada, and their themes echoed the most important provisions of the Hamas covenant in every one of them. And they weren't just entertaining adults. As we could see through those grainy films, the participants brought their kids and had them sing and dance about Hamas and the killing of Jews. And so there you saw Shikri Abu Bakr thanking Mahmoud Zahar and Jamil Hamami for participating in their skits. So Shikri Abu Bakr was the president of the Holy Land Foundation. And he and the other adults were spreading Hamas's message to the audience, including to children. Another senior leader of the HLF was Mohammed El-Mazain. We talked about him in episode 1 because he was the person that Marzouk called before he sent the money for the weapons. Mohammed El-Mazain often spoke to the audience at these festivals to raise money. And in one of those events, Mohammed El-Mazain explained, the Intifada planted the love of death, brothers, and the love of martyrdom in the hearts of young guys. That's a quote.
هناك تحولات جذرية حدثت في القضية الفلسطينية بعد الانتفاضة. بعد قيام الانتفاضة، وكلكم يعرف تاريخ بدئها ولا داعي لذكره أيضا. تحولات على الساحة الفلسطينية، فقد كرس التيار الإسلامي في داخل الأرض المحتلة ولله الحمد، بعد أن فقد الشعب الأمل وفقد الناس الأمل بمن حواليهم من الذين كرسوا خطبا وشعارات لم تأت على الأمة وعلى الشعوب المحيطة إلا بالويل والدمار والثبور، فعادوا إلى ربهم واستمسكوا بعقيدتهم ولجأوا إلى المساجد لكي ينطلقوا منها. وفعلا كانت انطلاقة مباركة، وهذه الانطلاقة من المساجد لم تكن عارضة ولم تكن آنية، إنما كانت هناك تربية وإعداد، وكان هناك جهاد واستشهاد، وكان هناك تضحية.
Then he goes on to say, they're no longer crying over a martyr. Rather, there are shrills of joy and there are congratulations, talking about people dying on behalf of Hamas.
So martyrdom, or dying for the sake of the cause, was something to be celebrated.
Yes, absolutely. It was something that people wanted.
And the IAP was responsible for spreading Hamas's rhetoric.
Yes, they spread their message through their media outlets. They had a newspaper which began as a very small, few articles, but evolved over years into a really big production. And that spreading of the propaganda has always been key to their success. They mention the media, even in the Hamas covenant, and you will hear that theme throughout the broadcast, how important the spreading of the message, the radicalization is to Hamas.
توزيع ونشر أفكار الحركة.
الجهاز الإعلامي يعني فكرة وجدت في بداية 87 لأنه الإعلام يعني يأخذ دور مهم في قضية التعريف بالحركة وبفعالياتها.
شو كان دورك بالضبط في الجهاز الإعلامي؟
صياغة البيانات، طبعا على ضوء الملاحظات اللي كانت تيجي من المناطق.
من أي مناطق؟
غزة، الخليل، القدس، نابلس.
An exchange of letters between HLF leader Shikri Abu Bakr in 1991. Those letters clearly identified the IAP was responsible for distributing Hamas communiques and books because they had one of their donors or fans who sent a letter to Shikri Abu Bakr asking about it, wanting to receive those kinds of books and documents. So disseminating their message was important for their grassroots effort. Knowing that, Hamas also focused on educational institutions and curriculum. I'll pause here for a second because we've talked about some of the search warrants that led to evidence of this activity. But one place we've not talked about that led to the evidence of this activity was the home of a man named Abdel Halim Ashkar. In early 1994, the FBI executed a lawful, covert search of Ashkar's home and found documents secreted around the residence and photographed it. One of those documents was a document that talks about who had which responsibilities inside the Palestinian territories on behalf of Hamas during that first intifada that we've been talking about. And a large focus of that document was what they perceived to be an insufficient Islamist presence in schools and universities in Gaza and the West Bank. They knew which universities, which teachers, which employees, and even which students were Islamists and which were not. And they stated their goal was ending control of non-Islamists of educational institutions and, quote, forming student unions in all grades to assist us in carrying out our plans. The document went on to say, quote, the Education Committee must understand its role and work to Islamize education from the students, the teachers, and employees. Now, interestingly, they noted that the Islamic University of Gaza was already a stronghold at the time, which wasn't a surprise because that was one of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin's entities. They did the same analysis for other charitable centers and noted the Islamic Center of Gaza and the Islamic Society of Gaza were also entirely controlled by them, meaning Hamas, at the time, but that their goal was to establish control over more charitable entities, more institutions in Gaza and the West Bank. But interestingly, during this early part of the First Intifada, the institutions the HLF was sending money to there were the Islamic University of Gaza, the Islamic Center of Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were going to these entities.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of money. Over 30 years ago?
Yeah, during that time.
Now, during that period, was Hamas at odds with other Palestinian groups?
Yes, kind of like we talked about last episode, is that they wanted control over Hamas. And they, by late 92, certainly there were problems between Hamas and Fatah, which was led by Yasser Arafat. And we found a report in the Palestinian Committee documents at El Barasse's home from August of 92. And in that document, it said that Fatah and Hamas almost had a large bet. And they referred to Yasser Arafat, quote, and his demons as, quote, traitors of Fatah, and concluded that Fatah needs to be confronted, disciplined, and its members tamed in their dens. And that is an exact quote from the document. And it said that the most supportive of these initiatives was Mahmoud Zahar. And remember, we just saw Zahar at one of the HLF IEP festivals and mentioned that he's still a current leader within Hamas. So that same report ended with an appeal to the brothers in Egypt to, quote, strike with an iron fist the men of Arafat in Cairo. And that, of course, refers to Cairo, Egypt.
So what was going on that had Hamas so upset with Fatah?
So, likely struggles for power and control. But then there was also some reporting at the time that indicated or speculated that Israel and the PLO might have been attempting to work together on a compromise, which is, we've learned from Hamas's own covenant, they say no to compromise. And then in December of 92, Israel deported 400 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, leaders and fighters to Lebanon, including Mahmoud Zahar. They were deported. And according to documents and videos seized, in the HLF case and what we've been talking about, the HLF was the first organization to actually send money to support these deportees.
أخ من الإخوة اللي موجودين هنا بالتحدث مع الإخوة وجدناهم إنهم كلهم يعني مسلمين وبينتموا لحركة يا جهاد يا حماس وفي بعض إخوة ما ينتموش لأي حركة وإنما.
But these deportations led to negotiations between Israel and the PLO, with Israel announcing it would publicly work with the PLO, but not Hamas or PIJ. And some people in Hamas at the time speculated the PLO was complicit in the deportations. And of course, that was a huge rift between Hamas and the PLO.
الذي يقبع في سجون الظلمة المستكبرين لا بد أن يخرج حالا.
Did the PLO and Israel negotiate?
Yes, they did. And they entered into a peace agreement that was to forge the way toward a two-state solution, towards Palestinian self-rule, and towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Many people in the Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, celebrated at the time. They were happy for a chance at hope. But Hamas did not. They were furious. So I'm Laura Burns, head of terrorism research at the Program on Extremism, and Jennifer Baker, senior research fellow for the Program on Extremism. Join us next for episode 3, where we'll delve into what Hamas did in reaction to the Oslo Peace Accords and how it used its U.S.-based infrastructure to evolve its tactics and techniques to continue proceeding in furtherance of the Hamas mission while, shall we say, avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. Join us next, episode 3, War is Deception.
Thank you for watching.
See you next time.